On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Andy Owens. He is the VP of Analytics at Deep Intent. We're going to be talking about best practices around hiring data engineers and analytics engineers. It's a new hybrid title that we'll ask him about across geographies and also some of the challenges of onboarding and ramping people up. And super excited to have you on, Andy. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Amir. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So obviously we know you're the VP of Analytics, but maybe if you can kind of fill in what you do day to day and what Deep Intent does, we can dive in from there.
Sure. Let me start with Deep Intent. So, we're essentially a marketing technology company focused on improving the lives of patients. So we work heavily with pharmaceutical companies and hospitals to basically provide advertising support for their initiatives. Down to, I would say, the meat of what I'm doing day to day. I'm really supporting, I would say, three functions. One is, kind of traditional BI reporting, right, out to clients or internal stakeholders. And then we're doing, some, I would say, like light analytics engineering, not full production data engineering, right? Supporting our platform, but really supporting internal dashboards, data feeds, et cetera, throughout the company. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, are data science components. So, building models that will drive, direct impact to revenue or, marketing campaign performance that have, an obvious impact on our bottom line.
Awesome. Sounds like some dynamic and constantly changing work, if you ask me. So to dive on in, I guess let's talk a little bit about. I know we talk at the top of the podcast. I mentioned we'd be talking about best practices around hiring data engineers, analytics engineers, which is becoming a quick new title, and kind of some of the challenges that are faced in looking for particular skills. And I guess before you start, maybe fill us in like what your team looks like. How I know you mentioned you're responsible for some of the BI as well, how much your work is externally facing. Maybe give us a little context there.
Yeah, sure. So, I'd say we do have quite a lot of client facing contact, right? So we're working with our clients, maybe not all the time, but probably like 10% of our client calls where they're supporting them, making sure that we're addressing really their baseline questions of what data they need, but also deeper level analysis that they might require. So that's handled by, kind of a small group of analysts. We do have quite a few. So I think right now we have, five or six. I've seen kind of similar breakdowns at other companies where you have a group of analysts and then you segment, the team into more of the data scientists who are going to be doing either long-run research projects or model development directly into machine learning and production support. So yeah, I would say, the dynamic there is, you're probably going to see a skew, right? More junior folks who might have, I would say, some of those more entry level or maybe like 2 to 3 years of experience with SQL or Python, right? Coming in as analysts. And then, you're going to heavily skew more technical as you go towards the data scientist, right? So not solely somebody who can, come in and run a machine learning algorithm. I think at this point in the industry, I know 8 years ago this wasn't the case, right? But every grad school and every undergrad program, I'd say in the country right now, has some kind of machine learning offering or data science offering, where somebody can go do logistic regression, right? I would say that's very important. But what you get to with the more technical data scientists quickly is really, you're going to need folks who have a very firm understanding of system performance, understanding things like memory, consumption, understanding just, core computer science concepts to make sure that the models can run. I think it's fine if you can maybe put something together locally, but when you actually deploy to the cloud and you have to support potentially millions of transactions a second, things change pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I have this conversation quite a bit when it comes to hiring managers looking for a data analyst or an analytics engineer. And the skill set has evolved so much in the last couple of years where SQL is no longer the, hey, you need to be good with SQL. It's, are you good with R? Are you good with Python? Not just from reading some basic code, but being able to be a little bit more functional than that. Like when you're going through the interview process, are you seeing talent catching up with some of those new skill sets? Are you still seeing a gap when you're looking to hire?
Good question. I think, baseline Python knowledge has gone a long way. I think people who maybe just learned about the standard library, back in their computer science kind of 101 program, maybe again, 8 years ago, 5 years ago, have really advanced, right? They do know a lot more of the libraries that are needed for data manipulation. But I would say the gap maybe isn't exactly with SQL and Python, but it's honestly the introductory concepts of computer science, such as like Linux, right? How do you go in and run a cron tab, right? Not very complicated, but you would be surprised at the amount of analysts who, they go and read, I forget the name of the book. It's something like Automate the Simple Stuff with Python or something like that. And it sounds great, but then if you want to automate something every day, you're going to need cron tab. That's the bare bones scheduling system. And just asking folks, how do you go do this? It really does weed out quite a few folks, right? I think there's kind of a gap in both the curriculum and then expectations that maybe employers will have, where I think this computer science, just basic curriculum is just not there. So, that's an area where I focus like development for folks, right? If they come on and they have, great Python experience, but they're clearly missing some of that Linux experience, hey, just throwing them in the deep end, making sure their first couple of assignments are okay, go execute some SQL from your Python script and automate it every day in like cron tab. Then you can advance them from there into more advanced concepts like using Airflow or other systems.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe what I'm reading is a signal of requiring Python. Really, the root requirement is needing some of that CS background because you look at analysts and not many maybe come with the computer science degree, and a lot of people get into analytics from different areas. Maybe it's stats, but a lot of different backgrounds end up as an analyst. And now that people have a lot more data to process, obviously the minimum, like you said, is you got to know some basic Python, strong SQL, but really is being able to operate within that space where the hard skills got just a little bit more technical, maybe. And maybe that's really what the market's looking for. And understanding core CS concepts should be maybe that, big step if you want to, move into a different type of analytics role as a part of your career path.
Yeah, I would say so. But I will also caveat this with like, every organization is different. I think I've, always been on the digital side really since I kind of left system integration consulting. And as a part of that, just having an understanding of what's going on from a computer science perspective has just been critical. But, there are many organizations that just need top level research, right? If you go to a research firm, you might just be compiling data or accessing a SQL, environment, extracting that data and running algorithms for your whole career, right? I know folks who are at healthcare providers that are doing that for years now. And that relevant analyst does exist there. I would just say, probably my perception is biased, right? In the digital space, you're going to need more of those computer science concepts.
I think the functional analyst still has his or her place in the market. And I think depending on where you're at and how much data volume your company is dealing with, obviously do kind of put on some of those requirements. And I guess when you mention, ramping somebody up and, looking to bring someone on and they're missing some of these core skill sets and throw them in the deep end. I mean, from your perspective, when you see someone, jump into the role and they're trying to get in and figure out some things in Linux, what do you see from kind of their development? Is it and again, per person, it could, be different, but is this a couple of day thing, couple of week thing? How much lead time can you give someone to kind of pick up these things before you're like, well, just not a fit?
Yeah, good question. I think the first kind of caveat there, I would say, is just, I describe the deep end as like, look, these are folks diving down and touching the bottom. This is how they're doing it. Watch them do it, right? So making sure that they have like a, some kind of peer that they're working with that can show them, hey, look, this is how I build my script that's going to, run every day. And again, something simple like cron tab. I'm going to beat this analogy over, but okay, how do I make sure that that runs every day? Look, this is how I execute this and make sure Linux just runs this every morning at 9 a.m. And I think once they run through that, right, you can then narrow them down into saying, okay, look, you need to make sure your script executes in the Linux environment, right? You need to make sure that you select the correct configuration, right, when you're setting your cron tab settings. And then you need to make sure that your output is expected over like 2 or 3 days. So honestly, I would say it shouldn't take much time. I would say probably a week to 2 weeks. And then, if there's any gaps, right, you do kind of fill those in with training as well, right? So, provide them a template. If they have gaps, provide them exactly what they need in terms of, okay, here's some reference material. Here's maybe a YouTube video or an online course in Coursera or Data Camp or something, just to narrow them down and make sure that they have a very clear guideline on what to learn and then how to execute it.
That makes sense. And I guess I'm wondering, like, when you're interviewing, you're looking to hire, obviously your ideal candidate's going to be the person who, ticks off all the boxes. Obviously, that doesn't always happen. You're not going to get the candidate that's, 5 stars and, bells ringing, it's the right person. There's going to be some trade offs. When you're looking for those trade offs, typically, are you looking for given apart skills for aptitude? Are you, functional? Or is there any areas that you, I guess, assume can train easier and you need a little bit more of the core skills coming in?
That's a good question. I think for areas where we have at my current company, client facing analysts, we're always making sure they have like digital media experience. And then I would say, just generally, right, if there's folks who are going to have to deal with stakeholders, making sure they have really strong experience doing that. I think, again, you get a kind of lot of new hires, usually in some of these analyst positions who maybe, again, don't have too much experience interacting with, hey, maybe you have to throw them in front of a director who manages 15 people and they're going to come in and ask very strategic questions of this analyst that the analyst might just get lost in the data, right? I think it's really having to having an inventory of what you believe their role will be and then matching that with the skill set, right? And I think that's probably where a lot of companies and hiring managers even kind of go astray, is that they don't focus enough on what the actual role is. They may focus on, oh, hey, like we know we're missing data engineering skills. Let's hire someone pretty technical, right? And get them like an analytics engineer. Okay, that's fine. But all the deliverables for this person really, right? If you look through all your requests or Jira tickets or something for the last 6 months, they're all client facing. So you really need that focus. And I think that helps drive the appropriate decision making around skills.
That's actually really good advice. And I think the one thing I see a lot, and I'm curious to get your perspective on it, is obviously you guys at the company at Deepiton have a certain way of doing things. Your previous organization, people coming in have done things a certain way. When you're looking at to hire someone, how much of your internal processes do you have to try to, take out of your mind, take out of your, projection of how this person's going to do? Because obviously you guys might just do things differently and try to look at, as objectively as possible someone's, core skills. Because what I hear a lot is, they're close, but it's not a fit. And it's kind of like, well, the skills are really there and they might do a little bit differently. Can you map that across? And sometimes that tribal process knowledge of the internal skews a little bit more than might be necessary.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, right? Every organization functions differently. I don't think I've ever gone into an organization that had like a tech department that had like the same kind of ticketing system, right? Everybody used Jira, but they totally customize it a different way, track progress in different ways, have different technical setups, right? And that's just one organization, right? Analytics is a similar way, right? A couple previous companies have had very informal ways of handling just ad hoc requests. Whereas, some other companies have had very formal ways of tracking it because hey, maybe it actually analysis ended up going to the CFO and lands in a number that ends up on the street, right? You need some controls over that. So I would say the process shouldn't determine the person, right? And I think that's hard to get away from in some cases. I think what's most important is to really, again, back into, hey, what is this analyst going to be doing every day? And can they handle these requests, right? Did I shape my even technical assessment questions in my interviews to actually test for that skill, right? Are they able to be given some abstract data set, a high level business question, and get to the point of that? Or, are you trying to make sure somebody's super detail oriented, finds the exceptions in the data, maybe those outliers that you threw in on purpose that are going to skew the outcomes, and make sure that they can find really detailed insights and provide that back to the tech team, right? Those are very different kind of functions that an analyst can play. And I think it's important, again, just to back into what's the role they're going to be doing. Process shouldn't really be determining the person.
How does geography factor into some of your hiring? Obviously, how do you account for geography? Maybe we just start there.
Yeah, good question. I mean, since I really started my career, I've generally worked with overseas teams or at least, remote teams. So it's not really, especially this coronavirus world, it's not very foreign to me. And, I think for me, right, I've always found it easy to delegate. I think, you need to back into, okay, what are the commonalities in communication, right? you're probably going to want to put things in writing, right? You get people to agree to things on calls, you send out those action items in writing, you make sure that they can confirm those action items, right? And I would say that's more like an operational process, right? To make sure the offshore teams work. But, especially examining on the ground talent across the world. I think at this time I've worked in like 9 different countries across the continents. And the commonality again would be okay, make sure that again that the person matches the role, right? And that you actually have a good understanding of what they're going to be doing. Because hey, you might want somebody with fantastic English skills if you're going to throw them in front of a client or the CEO. Or if, hey, maybe that's okay, right? If you guys have to over communicate in some cases and you need somebody with awesome technical talent who you can fund in that country. So, I think for me, it's always been okay, managing those cultural differences and making sure there's clear communication is the process challenge. Hiring, again, goes back to the same technique you would use whether somebody's sitting next to you or across the globe, right? Really understanding the role and expectations from the business, not just your kind of bias about what the person will do. And then I think probably the main operational consideration you have, right, is just coverage, right? Making sure you have folks that are available during business hours to respond to the types of requests that you actually need. Don't skew your folks to, I don't know, Central Asian time, right? If you know that you're going to have, the CEO demanding something at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right? You're going to need a good balance. But I think that, again, comes down to understanding the role, understanding the business, and seeing where you can distribute work because there's always benefits to it, right? I think, especially where you have maybe technical teams abroad, it's always a good thing to have your analysts close to your technical teams, right? I've seen many instances where the data engineering team is far away from the analysts, right? And hey, that little cooler break where somebody can just go tap somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, I'm trying to join this data. It doesn't really make too much sense to me. Those kind of questions can just get resolved offhand. And there's no maybe concern about having to reach out to somebody on Slack or an email to get an answer, right? The in person component does matter. And again, that I would say transfer of knowledge between the tech teams and analyst teams is super important. Just as important as the business stakeholders and analysts communicating. But I think if you distribute out your technologists, you should be distributing out your analysts as well.
That's some awesome advice, Andy. I think there's some nuggets in there in terms of growing your analytics team and also having to deal with you've dealt with multiple geographies. Thanks for being on the podcast, sharing your insights. I think it's been fantastic. If somebody wants to reach out to you, like to follow up on any of these topics, what's a good avenue to contact you at?
Yeah, just reach out to me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Awesome. We'll include your LinkedIn in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on. I appreciate it. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Amir.
Absolutely. And that's it for this episode of the podcast. We'll be back again with another guest, another set of topics. And until then, I always ask for two things. One, keep subscribing to the podcast. The organic growth has been really fantastic to see. I can't thank you all enough. And secondly, if you have any thoughts in terms of topics you want covered, just feel free to message me on LinkedIn. I'd love to be able to align those with future guests. Until next time, thanks.